What comes to mind when you think of the struggle against apartheid? Perhaps you think of Nelson Mandela, his peaceful demonstrations, and his abolition of the institution that would eventually earn him a Nobel Peace Prize. Or is it about the beatings, torture, and human rights abuses that took place at the hands of the white minority that led South Africa? Today, we are going to explore the history of South Africa and its struggle for independence, and try to understand the shades of grey that often go unexplored when retelling a history as complex as this. Are the freedom fighters always the good guys, or is the story a bit more complicated than that? Well, let's find out. The formation of the country that would eventually come to be known as South Africa can be traced back to the discovery of the Cape of Good Hope by Portuguese sailors in late 15th century, who were looking for an alternate route to Asia, with whom European nations traded with. In 1652, the first European settlements in South Africa were established by the Dutch East India Company in what is today Cape Town. Conflicts with the inhabitants of the region over the years led to many wars between the Europeans and Bantu populations. In 1795, the British captured parts of South Africa, then handed it back to the Dutch before taking it back again. Eventually, in 1814, a treaty was signed confirming British ownership of South Africa, or Cape Colony as it was called at the time. With Britain now at the helm, growing discontent among the Dutch settlers, also known as the Boers, would lead to a wave of migration north and away from the Brits in what came to be known as the Great Trek. The tensions resulted from the British abolition of slavery, excessive taxation, and cultural differences. The arrival of British and Dutch settlers would require the displacement of indigenous peoples, most notably the Zulus, led by King Shaka Zulu. This would culminate in the Anglo-Zulu conflict of 1879. Victory by the Brits would bring the Zulu kingdom under the rule of the British Empire. The migration of Dutch settlers would also lead to the formation of two republics, the Orange Free State and Transvaal. The discovery of gold and diamonds in the new regions inhabited by the Dutch settlers would prompt the British to a war of conquest against the Dutch settlers in the Anglo-Boer Wars. The British would successfully push back against the Dutch settlers, putting thousands of women and children in deadly concentration camps, and would come out victorious, making the Boer republics colonies of the British Empire. By amalgamating the British and Dutch colonies, the Union of South Africa was formed in 1910. So there you have it, the colonization of African territories by European powers, leading to forced displacement of the native black populations, as well as workers from the Indian subcontinent. In summary, the Dutch colonizers get colonized by the British colonizers. But the disenfranchisement of the black population would not stop with the unification of South Africa. You see, from its inception, South Africa treated its black population as second-class citizens, with many confined to reserves by laws such as the 1913 Land Act, which prevented them from buying land outside these reserves. This, and other discriminatory laws like it, would precede the systemic legislation that would come into effect in the apartheid era. The African National Congress, a movement for the black elite, was formed in 1912 after the unification of South Africa. From the onset, this group would petition the British government on behalf of its black population, but often to no avail. After taking power in the 1948 general election, the National Party, the ruling party at the time, began entrenching the ideology of apartheid. And while South Africa was already segregated, it introduced a set of legislation further entrenching the separation between races. Upon taking public office in 1950 and eventually becoming Prime Minister, Hendrik Verwoerd would play a key role in shaping the policies that would go on to define apartheid South Africa, earning him the title of the Architect of Apartheid. These laws would have social, political, and economic implications on the non-white population. Some of these laws include the Prohibition of Mixed Marriages Act of 1949, which, as the name suggests, prevents the marriage between whites and non-whites. There was also the Population Registration Act of 1950, which issued citizens with an identity document stating their race. There were three categories of race: white to describe the European settlers, native to describe the Africans, and coloured for those of mixed heritage. Another category would later be created for individuals from parts of Asia, including India and Pakistan. And while this document highlighted people's racial identities, these decisions were just as much about their social acceptability as it was about their physical appearance. These categories would impact where they could live, what job you could do, your right to vote, and many other things. It would also bring about a lot of confusion, especially for those who were of mixed heritage, and sometimes they would have to reclassify their racial identity, often at the discretion of the local racial classification board. In 1984, for example, 518 coloured people were reclassified as white. 2 whites became Chinese, and 89 coloured people became African. It's no surprise that most of the reclassifications were for individuals to become white, as this was the apartheid after all, so most of the laws tended to protect the economic advantages of the white minority. One of the more interesting cases of reclassifications was Vic Wilkinson, who was classified as white and then coloured and went back to being white. He was finally settled on being coloured in 1984 when he married an Asian woman. Another law was the Reservation of Separate Amenities Act in 1953, which, very much like the American Jim Crow laws, imposed segregation of all public facilities like stadiums, toilets, and public transport. The 1950 Group Areas Act started the physical separation of the races in urban areas, while the 1959 Bantu Self-Governing Act specified that different racial groups had to live in different areas. It would also displace black residents who had been living in white areas by moving them out of the city to townships where they had no rights to own property but could only rent. The disenfranchisement of the black population of South Africa would lead its people to voice their dissatisfaction with the system. Key organizations in the resistance include the ANC and the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Congress. This organization broke away from the ANC due to disagreements on the ANC's multiracial policies. You see, what happened was, the PAC wanted a more Africanist-centered set of policies which would eventually lead to its ban in 1960. The group would grow more militant over the years, and by the early 90s, after the abolition of apartheid, its military wing would carry out several massacres, living up to its slogan of "One settler, one bullet." The ANC itself would initially employ non-violent tactics, including boycotts and marches in protest of apartheid, whilst the PAC took a more militant stance. Leaders of both organizations would become targets of law enforcement, most permanently Nelson Mandela, who would be imprisoned under the premiership of Verwoerd after he spearheaded a movement to overthrow the government. Mandela himself founded Umkhonto weSizwe, pardon my pronunciation. This was also known as MK, and it would be the armed wing of the ANC. This wing would launch a series of attacks against the government as a show of resistance against the government's repressive laws. Mandela himself would travel around Africa looking for funding for the group's actions. It's important to note that this increased acts of militancy came after the ANC abandoned its policies of non-violence as a result of the Sharpeville massacre. This event saw police officers fire on a group of peaceful protesters, killing 69 people and injuring many more. Nearly all of the victims had been shot in the back. The banning of the ANC and PAC, as well as the imprisonment of many of its leaders, would create a vacuum in the anti-apartheid movement, one that was fueled by organizations such as the Black Consciousness Movement of South Africa, which gained prominence in the 70s. Led by Steve Biko, this organization was frustrated with the white-led political activism speaking up for the oppressed black populations. He would argue for black people themselves to become agents of change with a new identity and consciousness, one that was devoid of any inferiority complex. The idea that black people could take control of their own destiny spread like wildfire amongst university campuses, whilst taking inspiration from similar struggles in the black diaspora, including the African American struggle for civil rights, as well as the other African countries gaining independence from their colonizers. and in the Caribbean, Marcus Garvey touted Pan-Africanist ideas. As with the ANC and PAC, leaders of the Black consciousness movement would become targets of law enforcement. Steve Biko's actions would eventually get him banned and deported to his hometown, where despite restrictions on his movements and who he was allowed to meet up with, he continued to build community programs. In August 1977, Steve Biko was arrested. He would eventually die from injuries he sustained from beatings he received whilst in custody. On the international stage, the anti-apartheid movement was gaining momentum, with countries like Britain and the United States electing to impose sanctions. South Africa would also be expelled from the Commonwealth. In 1976, riots began in Soweto and would continue till the following year. An estimated 600 people were killed. In 1978, P.W. Botha became Prime Minister and would uphold the status quo until 1989, when he was forced to step down and was replaced by Willem de Klerk. De Klerk was determined to end apartheid and would introduce a new constitution giving rights to all. He would also release members of the ANC, including Nelson Mandela, after he had spent 27 years in prison. By 1994, the first democratic elections were held and Mandela was elected president. The post-apartheid era began with the establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, authorized by Mandela and led by Archbishop Desmond Tutu. It would investigate human rights abuses that had taken place during the period. Victims were given a platform to testify about their experiences, and perpetrators would testify and request amnesty. Amnesty was granted as long as two criteria were met. 1. The crimes were politically motivated and proportionate, and 2. There was full disclosure by the person seeking amnesty. It would receive more than 7,000 applications by perpetrators of human rights abuses, and about 850 of those were granted amnesty. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission allowed for testimonies to be brought to light, revealing the atrocities committed by the apartheid regime and the liberation movements, including the ANC. The struggle against apartheid was one of many civil rights movements to come out of the 20th century. It offers lessons on the importance of determination and, more importantly, the need for reconciliation to be carried out. And despite the challenges that South Africa faces today, the lives of much of its people are greatly improved thanks to the sacrifices of its people in the face of a tyrannical government. When we consider the struggle against apartheid, it's important to consider the nuances, especially regarding how the freedom fighters went about their actions. Do we only consider the ultimate goal, freedom for its people? Or do we also consider the acts of terror that sometimes took place with massacres happening? Perhaps it's not up to us as mere consumers of history, but really it's up to those directly impacted by these events.